Oh, thanks everybody for coming. So I'll talk a little bit about Venezuela, the background, a little bit of the history in case you don't know much about it. Just to put it in context to the rest of the talk and the delegation and the slides I'm going to show, the visit I made in August last year. So why should Venezuela matter to Australian socialists? It's thousands of kilometres away on another continent, and probably a lot of people don't even know where it is. But it's because Venezuela was the centre of a social revolution which began in 1998 when Hugo Chavez was elected as president of Venezuela. He'd been in the army since his youth and had been jailed for leading a coup in 1992. So we all assumed this was just another military dictatorship when we heard about it in sort of the beginnings of 2000. So Chavez ran for president in 1998 and won. He organised a constituent assembly of ordinary people. They were voted on, and the recommendations of the new constitution was accepted by, I think, about 65-70% of the population. And in it he abolished the upper house, so it meant they only had one legislative assembly. And everything was simplified, and he got everybody able to vote. Before people couldn't vote, they didn't have a cedula or citizenship. Now, Chavez wasn't a socialist initially. He thought there could be sort of a middle way between capitalism and socialism. But he radicalised when there was an attempted coup in 2002, organised by the United States and the State Department with the oligarchs of Venezuela. And there was, after that, there was an oil boycott also organised by the oligarchs and the bureaucrats within the oil industry. So that really radicalised him, and at the Social Forum in Argentina in 2005, he called for socialism of the 21st century for the first time. Now that was a very brilliant move because it obliterated Soviet socialism, which had failed, and really was going to move forward in a new way of organising socialism. So there was really radical changes once in 2003, beginning in 2003, and a new form of socialism was initiated that was democratic and legal, and it was based on the community councils and the social missions. And he was challenging capitalism as the economic basis of an economic base sort of an impoverished third world country. Now he didn't actually aim at this point to eliminate capitalism. It's still a capitalist society and capitalist economy, but it was going to be based, giving power to the missions and to the community councils. It had the effect of spreading radical changes in the rest of Latin America, this experiment, which began in really 1998 and continued on up to 2012. It was radical changes in the rest of Latin America, Ecuador, Bolivia, and a pink tide spread to Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and most of the countries of Central America, except for Colombia. But that has all changed now, all of that. But it was a pink tide that really worried the United States because Latin America had been the backyard of the United States, and which was the power of their economy and the exploitation of all the wealth they extracted out of Latin America. It was a total challenge to that whole scenario. But the achievements Chavez made was by giving power to the poor. He said the only way the poor could get out of their impoverishment was to give them power to change it. So he set up these social missions. There were more than 30, and he probably a few more introduced since then, which were to tackle housing, unemployment, health, and a whole lot of other different issues regarding youth, Indigenous people, all sorts of missions. And the community councils, people could organise their own affairs. It was set up so that all you had to do was, say, an apartment block here with about 200, say, apartments in it. They could organise their own community council, elect a treasurer and a secretariat or president, and they would have to hold meetings. But they could ask for any money from the national government under Chavez, and whatever they wanted to be done in that local community, they would have the funds to do it. So it bypassed all the mayors, the councils, the governors, and all the corruption. The money was given directly to the communities. In the countryside, the communes were based on a smaller grouping of people, maybe only a small village, maybe only 20 families or so. So some of the results of this organising over the last 10, 15 years was that 72% of the total budget went into social expenditure and the well-being of its people. And this is a world record. No other country in the world has done this. And the number of hospitals grew by 3.5 times since 1999. They were building hospitals all over the countryside and all over the big cities that were free to people to use. They invested in a new model of humanitarian care for everybody. There was barrio adentro mission. The doctors, Venezuelan doctors, wouldn't go and work in the barrios. The barrios are where these sort of huts or just shacks that were built on the sides of the mountain overlooking Caracas. None of the Venezuelan trained doctors would go and work there, but he brought in 20,000 Cuban doctors who went and lived in these little cubicles, or sort of 6-sided hexagon building. Upstairs the Cuban doctors lived, and downstairs they had the clinic, and it was free to everybody, and the medicines were free. Even the middle class were going to the Barrio Dentro missions because it was free and because the medicines were totally free as well. They set up free medical universities who trained 27,000 new doctors in the last few years. And another 30,000 were going to graduate in 2017. And they trained it under a system in which the students would go and work with the Cuban doctors in the barrios and then have classes in the afternoon. In 2016, the percentage of retired people who received a pension was 90%, regardless of whether they'd paid into a superannuation fund when they were working or not. Before that, there was no retired pension for anybody over the age of 55 or 60, unless you'd paid into a very expensive fund while you were working. And that, of course, that affected a lot of women. And the whole idea was that the government was going to repay the social debt to the population who had never benefited from the oil reserves, which had been discovered in 1920 in Venezuela and exploited by the United States. And the estimate is that before Chavez came along, 65% of the population were living in dire poverty. So there were spectacular results of the housing mission for disadvantaged families. They built, since 2011 when the housing mission was set up, they had built, when I went there in August, 1.7 million apartments that were given away virtually at a very low cost. If people were working, they paid a small amount of money, but they could not resell these apartments, but they were there for poor people who had nowhere else to live. Food consumption had increased by 80%. Before Chavez, only 3 out of 10 people would eat regularly chicken or meat or coffee and corn and basic goods. So you can understand there was this massive media campaign began to grow and developed against Chavez and Chavismo in the last 15 years. And that intensified when Hugo Chavez died in March 2013, March 6th, because he'd had got cancer, and because of the cancer treatment, he'd developed pneumonia and he died. There was a massive outpouring of grief by millions of people in Caracas for the funeral. So the street protests developed in a big way when President Maduro was elected. He was the vice president. President Nicolas Maduro was elected in February 2014 by a very small margin. He didn't have the charisma that Chavez had, unfortunately, but and a big campaign was organised then by the opposition. They thought this was their chance to get rid of him. Now the street attacks began again in February last year, because because of the economy and the attacks on the economy, the drop in the oil price. There were food shortages due to hoarding and very high prices, and the opposition thought they had the chance to overthrow Maduro and force his resignation. There were to be governor elections last year, and they thought they had a chance of gaining the majority of the governors, which were, there's 23 states. They'd only had 5 at this stage, I think 4 or 5 at this stage. They thought they could get a majority. And so that's when you saw that big campaign on television last year in Australia, all over the world, all throughout Europe, the United States. That was a failed state, that people were starving, and the US government and especially Trump was going to come to the saviour of the Venezuelan people. You can imagine. So this campaign was carried out also on ABC TV and radio. It was a horrendous campaign, and all we could do was sit in our lounge rooms and sort of throw newspapers at the television set. It was horrendous. We knew that this was a lie and totally a distortion of really what was going on in Venezuela. I know there are problems, and there still are problems, but to make out that there was shootings and killings by the government was a total lie, total distortion of the reality and what was happening there. So it was in this context that Venezuela Analysis, which is one of the websites which you should look at every now and again to find out the truth of what's happening in Venezuela, they organised a brigade to try and counter the lies, the web of lies, throughout the whole of last year. So it was a delegation of 12 of us. There were 3 women from Belize, 8 US citizens who had, a lot of them were children of Latin American immigrants, and myself. So I'll just go through a few of the things that we saw in Venezuela, and just give a bit of background to that. So the first was this apartment block. It's called the Oscar Lopez Rivera block of flats, right in the middle of the city, 6 buildings, in which there were 1,000 families living there in the inner city. All those apartments had been given to these people, mainly rural families who had moved to the city to try and find work. And they'd also set up small businesses within this apartment blocks. This was a bakery. And also they were making nappies and dress designs and bags in these small businesses. That was a laundry, and they were also doing furniture making. And there was a communal garden in front of this, the big block of flats. Then we I went to a mural painting in San Augustin. There's murals all over Caracas, which make it a very lovely city and beautiful to see. These murals celebrating Chavez and Chavismo. And that was one being done by students and art students in the small barrios. Now this is a computer factory that we visited in, it's called Canaima, also in the middle of the city of Caracas. They were there making millions, they had distributed, I think, about 1.5, 2 million computers to school children, totally free. And they had taken them, the children could take them home, so the grandmothers and grandparents and aunts and uncles could use the computer as well. They had programs in it that they couldn't access pornography, of course, from the United States. And they also had a different operating system. They had the free operating system from Linux. So that meant that Microsoft had no input, no control, no selling of software in Venezuela. So that's why you can imagine why they're so furious at this social experiment. So they were assembling the computers there from Chinese computer parts, but they had designed all the software. We next went to Barlovento on the east side of Caracas, of the country. It's about 3 or 4 hours drive away. This was a small town maybe where there were mainly Afro-Americans, Afro-Venezuelans had settled in this area because this is where they grew all the cacao, the chocolate factory, and chocolate trees, and there were also, they'd set up small cooperatives, but also there was a state government run business involved in it as well. But they'd built a university here for people to attend university. There were a lot of soldiers, National Guard, you can see in the photo. That was because during the opposition attacks on the police and the National Guard, one National Guard had been killed in this area, and so they were really worried what was going on. And they'd found the body, the day we were there, they found the body in the river that had been killed murdered by the opposition. So there we went to a gas distribution centre in Barlovento where they'd set up a distribution centre for gas. Most people don't have gas connected to their houses. It's through these containers. And so that was distribution of gas for cooking at very, very cheap prices and very safe containers. Also in Barlovento there was a chocolate factory. This was a chocolate factory we visited. There was also a factory, this was a banana factory, banana chips. They had realised that was a really good commodity they could sell. They got thousands of banana trees, and so they were making a banana jam and developing a feed for pigs out of banana as well. That had expanded, that was doing so well that they were building a factory next door to it 3 times the size of the present building. We also visited, here was the program, you may have heard of it, called, it's called, I've forgotten the name of it now. La Sistema. So here were some students who had been given instruments and were learning to play. That was in also in Rio Chico, in Barlovento, and we heard them play a piece of music. So then we travelled to the state of Lara. This is the Afro-descendants. Their culture is commemorated and established and extended. It's a huge centre of Afro-Venezuelans living there. And so they were drumming and singing African songs. I'd also like to add that in Caracas we had seen a museum in which Chavez had set up, and it's where they're looking at the history of the Afro-descendants in Venezuela. That had never happened before. They had always been treated like they were second-class, fourth-class citizens. But their whole history, because there were millions of slaves that had been brought from Cuba and from other islands and worked in the cacao fields in Venezuela, and later the sugar fields. So then we travelled to the state of Lara. We had a nice day on the beach. And here we visited the huge factory of, now called Proletarios, Unios, in Barquisimeto. This is a very interesting experience here because this had been a huge beer factory run by a transnational conglomerate, Brahma. It was a huge site. And when Chavez had died, the owners of Brahma had decided they would get out and sell. It was going to be a military coup in Venezuela. There was no point carrying on business there, and they would get out and sell. So all the workers had been sacked. But you couldn't do that under the laws that Chavez had brought into the country. You couldn't just sack workers without a reason. And so the 100 workers there, there used to be initially about 2,000, occupied the factory for 2 years to prevent the loss of equipment and materials. They didn't know what was going on because they said they were going to leave, but all the equipment was there. I think there was about 200 tons of barley feed or yeast for the beer that was still there. So there was something odd going on. The workers were continually attacked by the police because that state of Lara was actually in control. The governor was an opposition governor. And it wasn't until the local commune got involved and helped them get legal protection to run the factory that they began to set up as a socially owned company to supply animal feed using the barley that had normally been used for the, to make beer. And it's interesting that WikiLeaks had a role here because they learned from the Panama Papers that the Brahma factory was being sold to Cisneros, and he's one of the biggest capitalists in Venezuela, who owns TV stations and all the beer brewing factories. But they revealed that it was going to be sold in this secret deal to Cisneros, and who runs Polar Beer, and it meant he would have had a monopoly on beer sales, so he could have set any price he wanted, which was against the law. It was illegal for, to have a monopoly in any production of any goods in Venezuela under Chavez laws. To stop, also they were attacked in 2015. The opposition tried to burn down the factory, but the locals, people were alerted and managed to stop it. But they'd started, this was some of the remains of the fire from the plastics and the wooden crates stood at the back. But they managed to save it. The lawyers of Brahmas are still trying to get this factory back. We then stayed at a large finca in Barquisimeto, which was run by the movement of those without land, the MST. Now, you probably know them, they're from Brazil, and President Chavez brought them to Venezuela and gave them this area of land which wasn't being used to grow anything. The owner had done nothing with all this land, but he brought them there in order to teach Venezuelans how to grow food because of the mass exodus from the countryside, Venezuelan countryside, to the cities during the 1920s and 30s and through the last century. People had forgotten actually how to grow food. So they were teaching and training Venezuelans to grow all sorts of food. That was a new corn they had rescued in order to stop the sales of imports of GMO, genetically modified corn from the United States, which they had to buy before that at a massive price. So they were doing an incredible job there at the Barquisimeto farm. The next one we also visited, that's two of the women, again, from the farm workers. We also visited this group, a women's group in Lomas de Leon in Barquisimeto. They were dealing with domestic violence, and they were talking to women who had suffering domestic violence, and who they tried to, and they brought them in to talk about. It's a very delicate topic and difficult. So they were they'd worked out how to talk to women who they think were suffering from domestic violence and to begin to tackle it. So that was a big chat, a big talk with us on how they were dealing with those problems. It was a very poor area in the backwoods of Barquisimeto. And this building, President Maduro had given them the bricks and the mortar and the basic materials to build it, but he said, you go and build it yourselves. And so everybody had pitched in and built this building so they could have a space to meet and to talk. As you can imagine, you can't talk about personal things in the open air under a tree. They needed a place to meet. So that was one of the places we visited. We then visited El Maisal. It was another huge latifundia also in Barquisimeto. It was about 1,000 hectares. This is virtually the whole group of the International Brigade that had come there, and they showed us around this commune. They were. It was on the border between the states of Lara and Portuguesa. They're producing milk, cheese, coffee, corn, 12,000 tonnes of cornage a year, and they were distributing that in the local communities. Before they had been selling it back to Caracas, to the sort of bureaucrats in the office, in the central offices in Caracas, and it wasn't working. They weren't getting anything back. So they have sort of broken down that structure and were distributing it locally. That was the best way that it worked, in the way they could avoid the corruption. The workers had taken it over because the owner lived in Miami. He flew there once every 6 months in a helicopter, spent half a day there on the finca, and then left. So Chavez had offered him to come there and have a talk. He didn't arrive, so they took over the whole land. It had been abandoned virtually, and they were running it now as a very successful, huge farm. It's a summon tree, I won't talk about that. That's a view of the El Maisal farm, and up in the mountains, hills there, they were growing coffee. It was a beautiful estate. They also had a distribution plant for gas. They had a nursery they'd set up in Maisal, a bit further down the road, and they were teaching students who'd come there during the university days to learn about different plants, And then we went to a radio station, also in Lara, and which was a community radio station, and which had been visited often by Ali Primero. So that's just a few of the things we saw. And in conclusion, I'd just why the whole international campaign stopped, the whole immediate campaign stopped, was because with the governor elections, which occurred in October, like a month after we were there, is that the Chavistas won 17 out of the 20, might have been more, 18 or 19 out of the 23 governorships. But they thought the opposition, that because things were so bad, so difficult, that they would lose. But they didn't. The whole movement of the workers and young people are still have realised what they gained from Chavismo and from the last 15 years of the campaign to change the economy of Venezuela. And that's why the international media campaign stopped. It was ridiculous. The opposition, there was no real support for the opposition. And also with Trump threatening to invade Venezuela, people, even people who didn't really support the government, weren't going to go back to the days of the 90s when the United States ran the whole of Latin America. The economic situation is dire. Fred will go into that. There was plenty of food. I mean, I didn't show photos of the markets we visited, but there was plenty of food. But the problem is it's expensive and difficult. It's difficult to get hold of cash, the actual money, paper money, and the price is going up and up because of inflation, because there's a massive attack economically by the United States to destroy the economy of Venezuela. It'll be essential for Venezuela to survive, to improve the food situation and to change the inflation rate. Maduro has announced he'll go off the dollar and he's going to use Russian or Chinese currency. But I think I saw just today that they've got a new currency called Petro, which is a form of Bitcoin. I don't know how that's going to work, but the Chavistas told me, people I visited in the local barrios that we knew when we lived there, that 70% of the population are with them, and they're going to fight for this revolution and the social changes that have helped change their life so much. Because young people realise that they don't want to have to live by selling, rubbish on the streets, and so it's, if they're going to support Chavismo, you're going to get an education. So it's a choice between an education, I think, and the latest mobile phone. The opposition have large sums of money funded by the United States. There's a section of the National Guard and the police, people have told me, and the secret police who are totally opposed to the government, and so that's part of the problem as well. But the army is solid. There are probably a few sections of the army that are against Maduro, but the army is solid behind the government, and that will help them survive. The communes and the economy I've talked about are not yet strong enough to sort of overcome and to take over the capitalist economy. They really only account for 2% of the economy. But what you saw in that factory, they told us that, you know, if the opposition won, all of that, all the things I've shown you that I've talked about would just go. They would be wiped out. They would be destroyed overnight if the opposition gained power. And people realise that. So the significance of the Venezuelan revolution is that it's created new radical forms of grassroots organisation, the communes and the social missions. And it's put on the agenda once again the possibility of socialism, a new form of socialism, socialism of the 21st century, which is legal and which is democratic. So the struggle for Chavismo is not over yet, and the revolution continues, but we have to step up our solidarity work with Venezuela to counter the misinformation and the lies that come out even of our respected, so-called respected media channels. And I think we in the West owe the Venezuelans a debt and a duty to continue our solidarity work to the utmost, to change the impressions and the lies that have been distorted this revolution. It's still continuing and it's still a battle and it hasn't been lost yet.